All right, so thank you all so much for being here this evening. I'm Claudia Watts, the Director of Culture here at EDC, and I am so excited to be in conversation with Mr. Bear Combs Pittner. We're going to have a little discussion, and then we're going to follow that up with some Q&A from you all, and then we will have books over here for signing. So,
let's get it started.
All right, so about 2 years ago, we first met when I was moderating the Sustainable Culture Lab conversation. And I remember meeting you upstairs on the fourth floor of Eaton House with Moss, Kurth, and Bakari. Oh, Bakari. So, and I remember you explaining this concept of ethnocide to me. You said, "Hi, I'm Barrett, I'm a philosopher, and I'm working on this concept of ethnocide." And I was like, okay, that's interesting. You don't meet a lot of philosophers these days. You just read about them. And so I was very intrigued by the subject matter. I also read the zine that you all produced with Eaton, and I was really excited to see where everything was going. So now, 2 years later, you've got this book, and I'm very curious about the process. Because when we met, it started as, it's kind of like you had the kernel, right? But you were still building the world around it. And you were still really looking for the words to explain this existence or this concept to us in a way that we could accept or digest, right? And I think it's lovely that you talk about how we don't have the right words to diagnose our problem. And you kind of you introduce us to all these new words in the book, and you also break down all these layers of ethnocide and how it impacts us. So could you talk about that process? How did you find those words? How did you go about identifying those layers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess I'd say to describe the process started before the conversation we had, and the process began when I was just an opinion writer and I was trying to write about race and culture, and I could see from the feedback I get from my readers that they enjoyed my columns, but the point I was trying to get across wasn't resonating as clearly as I anticipated. And so through numerous columns, I would try to phrase things this way or that way or whatever to see which one clicked. And none of them ever clicked to the extent that I thought they should. And so at a certain point, I mentally was like, maybe there just isn't the language within our normal discourse for what I'm trying to say, and so I just need to go find it or make it. And so that's where the term ethnocide came into play. I made the term, and then I went and found out that somebody else had already made it, which I'll say at first I was kind of bummed. That wasn't that much fun. But Raphael Lemkin was a remarkable guy, and so his work actually empowered the idea. From my perspective, ethnocide was the destruction of culture, and I would look at race and division in the U.S. not from a racial or class lens, but from a cultural lens. And that's what I was trying to articulate in my pieces, and ethnocide provided this foundation. But then what happened is the path to find all the numerous other words to explain it. When I looked at Lemkin's work, I realized when he came up with the word genocide to describe the Holocaust and these atrocities that were just had been happening throughout Europe, and there wasn't a language to describe how bad they were, he changed the dynamic by creating new words. And I was like, well, that's what you have to do. If there's a linguistic void, you have to put new words in it. And it's easy to imagine that you only need one new word, but maybe you need a lot of new words. And so after I looked at Lemkin, I started looking at other European thinkers at that time to see what work they came up with, because World War I and World War II was basically the continent of Europe finding ways to destroy itself, and the language that they used at the time justified that destruction. So for them to come up with ways to stop having continental wars that became world wars, they had to create new words and new ideas to convince themselves that this way of thinking, this way of speaking was not beneficial. And through that exploration, I started other work and stuff that I had been familiar with. That language, I was like, this language connects to ethnocide. This provides a linguistic framework to articulating what I've already been thinking, but they've done a decent amount of research. So that's why you look at it and there's a lot of stuff about existentialism and German stuff and things like that.
Okay. Well, one of the things that really stuck out to me, I think it was part of the existentialism references that you were making, is you talk about white essence over all existence, right?
Yeah.
And it stuck out because for me, essence always relates to the soul, right? I always think about the soul as an essence, and your existence is more like this lifetime, this human form that you're in, more meant to carry out the lessons of your soul. So, but that you explained is a big foundation of the book, and to really understanding all of the other points you make. So, could you elaborate a little bit more about essence versus existence?
Yeah, totally. So first of all, if you start looking at European philosophy, you'll find that there will be a word that this school of thought, this word means this. In like another place or another country, the word will have a different meaning because it just will organically go like that. So like our understanding of essence over here is one thing, but within European philosophical thought, essence was essentially ideas and your identity, things that you could define yourself. And essences aren't bad per se, but since the work of Rene Descartes, the Cartesian worldview, which was I think, therefore I am, this narrative created this idea that essence is what determines your existence because I think, therefore I exist. So your thoughts, your essence, precede your existence. This was a philosophical way of seeing things throughout Europe, and for the longest time, no one really thought this was a problematic idea. Existentialism changed that dynamic where it said existence, because existentialism, the word existence is the foundation of that word. Existence precedes essence. And so if you look at the destruction that was happening in Europe in the 20th century, it was essentially like the essence, the idea of like a Germanic superior Aryan race, that idea of their essence being superior than the existence of other people created a language that could justify the rampant destruction of so many people throughout a continent. And so to give people the framework to articulate that that was bad, you had to be able to articulate that existence was more important. It precedes essence. So it's not that you think therefore you are, there's something that makes you who you are that has nothing to do with your mind. And I will say, I didn't personally have a baby, but me and my partner, we made a baby, and that baby exists now. And we don't know what its thoughts are, and it can't comprehend what its thoughts are, but it is real. Like, it exists. Its existence clearly precedes its thoughts. And so this is a very simple way of looking at it. And so in the book, I use this framework of essence to describe the identity that Europeans gave themselves when they left the continent. White isn't a place. Like if you are Norwegian, you call yourself that because you're attached to a place, and that place is what's giving you your identity, your framework, your customs, all that kind of stuff. And this is the language that we use all throughout the world. White, however, is not one. It's just an idea that Europeans created for themselves when they left the continent to sustain this idea of being European while never being in Europe. So it's not, as I try to shift from having a discourse about race and one about culture, I use the language of essence. We're like, this is just an idea. It's a white essence. And the sustaining of this essence has been like a foundational component of American existence. And you can see like our racial divisions and how people of color are treated in the US. The narrative for the longest time has been that the essence of whiteness gets to precede the existence of all sorts of other people. And so if we're trying to combat that, we need to make sure that we can articulate that existence precedes essence. And so there's nothing wrong with having a particular essence or idea. It's just if you believe that that idea is more important than the existence of other people or even your own existence. And that's a problem.
See?
So that was that.
Okay. So, all right. We talked about there's also this concept of bad faith. Okay. And that was my favorite one, and I could ask you a really like low, easy question about it. Like, which bad faith do you think is worse?
Oh, like existential or pre-existential?
Yeah.
Like there's not like it. The point is one's not more worse than the other because that say that one. So all right, I need to articulate what it is.
Yes,
Okay,
you do.
all right.
You do.
Sorry, I jumped the gun on this one. So in existentialism, there's also this idea called bad faith. In French, it's mauvaise foi. Um, and we all know this idea of having good faith relationships with people, which are like those are relationships that you can trust. Like it's in good faith. If I say go do something, I trust that that person's going to do it. That's a good faith relationship. If I go say, hey, can you go do this, and the person says, yeah, I'll do it, and they know they're not going to do it and they're lying to you, that is a relationship in bad faith. That's not sustainable. That's not healthy. You're just like lying to people. And so normally when we think of bad faith, the assumption is that the person who's lying to you knows that they're lying, that they are intentionally lying. They're deceiving you. That's traditional bad faith that we all kind of like think about. But in existentialism, Jean-Paul Sartre proposed this idea of bad faith or mauvaise foi, where the person who is deceiving you is actually deceiving themselves. So what they believe they're doing is being truthful, but they're just perpetuating a lie. And so the key thing about these words is not to say which one's better or worse. It's knowing that these two types exist. Because I think a lot of times, especially, we'll talk to, I think you can look at it in politics where somebody does something and you go, they have to know better than that. I expect them to know something. The question is like, why do you have that expectation? You have this expectation because you just want to believe that they are consciously aware of what they're doing and they're not just like delusional. But maybe they're just totally delusional. Maybe they're completely committed to believing that something that isn't true is true. And now they're going to do that.
But I think that that's a little more dangerous.
So it could be. So it's perfectly, I have nothing against someone saying that one is worse than the other. You can totally do that. But the most important thing is being able to know that there are these two types and you can identify it. Because the person who is completely unaware of what they're doing, that could show the opportunity that they could get educated. And maybe they do the right thing because now you showed them that the lie is a lie and not the truth. I'm not saying that we're not talking about percentages. We're not saying that this is more likely to happen. But the person who is intentionally, knowingly deceiving you, like that person could be completely impenetrable to knowledge because they don't care. It just kind of depends. But both of them are quite dangerous, and you need to have a word for it so you can distinguish between the two. Because if you're talking to somebody and you believe that they should know better and they don't, how can you have a proper conversation with them? You just can't. And so that's a key thing, this idea of bad faith. And bad faith is rampant throughout just like foundational America, and I could talk about that at length.
I'm not going to let you today.
I know, I can talk for a while.
Both of those things were so like important, really like the heart of the book for kind of moving through everything else. And so it brings me to my next question. Just throughout the book and throughout each layer, you make a point, you prove it, or you give an anecdote. And so you got the who, you got the what, you got the when, you got the how, where. But I keep asking myself, what is the why? Like the why of why all of this exists. And so you have here in Beyond Utopia, why existence in America is inextricably interwoven with the accumulation of wealth, and our society condones the act of acquiring this wealth at the expense of others. And so you talk about how, white people could not exist without money. But I guess my question is what does that say about humanity? Because I think that, money is something we've made up. So if it weren't money, would we not find something else to separate ourselves or assign value to or, people talk about money being the root of all evil, but what is the real why?
So, the question, hmm. So the answer is like, I can't say why people hundreds of years ago decided to like create a social structure that's just like inherently problematic. Like I can't say why they did that. I can say here are the philosophies that were popular at the time that incline people to think this way and to feel justified in doing things that clearly now we would just flat out call atrocities. So I can't say why people in the past did something in a particular way. But what I can say is if we know that things that happened in the past are problematic, and we have the language for saying why they're problematic, and we have the language for articulating what's a positive alternative, then we won't necessarily need to be preoccupied primarily with the why, because we'll be able to do constructive actions instead. So, why? I'm not really sure. There's a lots of reasons we could speculate it, and I talk about Orwell quite a bit in the book because one of the issues regarding like dystopian literature and why it's so popular is it shows a potential for people to lose their humanity, and there's a frightening way in which that happens. And for Orwell, his reference points were like what he experienced, like working in the British military in India. These are reference points, and so in the book, I show how if you have a society that linguistically is dishonest, is linguistically in bad faith, it can articulate that something that is bad is good, and something that is vulgar is dignified. You then can make it so that a whole populace of people can go around doing bad, vulgar things, fully convinced that they're good, dignified people. And that's because the language has been corrupted at a foundational level. Why somebody decided to corrupt the language at a foundational level, I'm not really sure. But, what's more important is making sure that people have the language and the philosophies to make sure that they can see that something is bad and then feel empowered and capable of doing something that's good instead.
So then, speaking of that, right? You also talk about how Raphael Lemkin, he escaped, war-torn Europe. He got to the U.S. He was a professor, I think, at Duke. But he spent his entire life fighting to get genocide into, to be adapted, to be used, to be recognized, and was ultimately a pariah within his academic circle.
Yeah.
So, would you say with writing this book that you are picking up that type of torch, and are you, prepared to accept the realities that come with that type of work in this structure that we live in, or is this more of you kind of diagnosing the problem, getting the diagnosis of the problem, and hoping to continue conversation around it?
Oh no, this is the commencement of the work. Like you know me because of my organization, the Sustainable Culture Lab, that existed before the book existed. So like doing work is the first part. The book is only like a conduit, hopefully something that allows people to understand the nature of the work even better. But 2 weeks from now, I have the Altars Festival, which focuses on ancestor remembrance, and that's part of the work. That's so none of this is me just wanting to have like conversations or people think that like I'm smart or good at things. Like I don't really care about any of that. It's more like I think we live in a place that's not. I think we live in a place that's bad, and I think we don't have the language to describe that it's bad, and that impairs us from doing good things. And I think there are so many people in our society that want to do good things, and we're like linguistically impaired and philosophically impaired, and it doesn't make sense for me in my mind to just say I just condone living like that. I just don't get it. Like there's so no, this is the commencement of work, and you know I will say like a lot of the Lemkin's writing and the work that he was doing, he didn't get much financial support. He was not a wealthy individual. People thought he was like a weird person. And that's basically how my life has been for like years. Like I don't make a bunch of money. This work is clearly me talking in a language that people don't understand. So most people thought I spoke gibberish. This book is probably gonna be one of the first opportunities that people that are actually my friends are gonna be able to understand like how I see the world and what I say. So this is not yes, it's a continuation, and that's really it. And all the work I do pertaining to just everything is a continuation of this work.
So what do you see the next, I guess, evolutionary phase of the Sustainable Culture Lab being? You know?
Oh my goodness, that is a way bigger question than you anticipate. But here, I guess, so I was talking to a friend the other day about the Sustainable Culture Lab, and she said that it's really the work is really important because it provides people like a shift in perspective. And I said, actually, it's not a shift in perspective from like something that's like great to like another thing. We're talking about like a society that at a foundational level is in bad faith. A society that has been structured about justifying the destruction of other people's culture for profit. A society that encourages people to live at the expense of other people. That's not like that's a nothingness. That's what we're talking about. And so the goal of the work of the Sustainable Culture Lab is to give people the framework to go from like a normalized nothingness to a something. Because if you live in a if you look at what culture is, and I talk about this in chapter 2, is that culture is people in a particular place working together to survive in perpetuity. That's just what it is. It's not one culture is not better than the other. If you live in a cold place, the culture you're going to make is one that's really great at surviving in a cold place. If you live in a hot place, it's going to be one for that. That's it. They're all apples and oranges. It's not a competition. America has tried to have a culture that's the antithesis of this sustainable idea that human beings have used to survive from the beginning. The America Foundation is that a certain group of people feel that they can live in perpetuity at the expense of all the people around them that don't look like them. Like if they live, it's a continent that's not Europe, and people said we can live here as Europeans at the expense of anything and everything that's here. That is not sustainable. And we don't actually know another way to live here. And if you look at just how America works as a whole, the amount of exploitative structures we have, the amount of things that like the negative discourse we have for doing things to help other people. Like the phrase welfare is negative here. Like it's the welfare of people. Like that's viewed as a negative thing in this country. That's crazy. The amount of words that we say in our society that are actually really like destructive, mean words that we use in reference to something positive. Like if someone does something good, it's common to say, "You killed it," And so like that's horrible. It's at such an extent that like we can't wrap our brain around it. So the work of the Sustainable Culture Lab is many pronged. But the first thing I want to do is give people the language to start articulating their world in a better way. And once you can start speaking more clearly and like constructively, then you can start doing more constructive things. And so, speaking that can be just the words you say in general, but it can also be like having a T-shirt that like expresses the language that you want to put out there in the world. It can be working on policy, where like the words in the policy are these constructive words, and not trying to like legitimize these destructive words and compromising with destructive people. Like the extent at which you can go, like we have a newsletter that goes out every week that's called The Word. I just give people like a word every week to like get a better vocabulary and saying more positive things. But that discourse right there can get expanded into podcasts and articles and all sorts of stuff where you actually start talking about things and building things in the right way. So like the space and the growth is to a level that's it's almost it's scary to comprehend because we're really talking about a place that's built on exploiting people and trying to create structures and language to make it so that we don't try to justify perpetual exploitation and division. And we don't have that prior to the language of ethnocide.
So I definitely want to go off on another tangent, but I know you guys have questions, so I'm going to open the floor up. We're going to take a few questions from you all out there. Let everybody jump at once.
So how do we do the microphones?
I think those are the only microphones we've got.
We're getting one, I think.
Oh.
Okay. Her right there. Jean jacket.
Well, thank you, Barrett. It's very exciting to see you as a published author. I know I've heard the term ethnocide many times. But you talked about ethnocide as a concept. In the times that we currently live in, where white nationalism is in everyday mainstream, we hear about it. Our country continues to have this race discourse. Can you tell us, where does the concept of ethnocide actually play out? And what is white nationalism? Like, how do we distinguish the two? And do you think is a precursor to one, or how would you explain in terms of like what you've published now in your book that we could apply to the conversation we're having today?
Yeah, perfect, great question. So first of all, we need to think about our concepts of white and black in the American sense derive from ethnocide. If you have a bunch of European people who are coming to a continent that's not Europe, and they have an idea of who they are, and they give themselves a name that's attached to their complexion and not like the physical location, that's a whiteness, and that identity they gave themselves is based off of the one-drop rule. So any presence of something that's not European is the erasure of their idea of themselves. So that right there is going to be a whole launch of the notion of white supremacy, white nationalism, because they're trying to sustain an ethnocidal division. Like, that is what they're trying to do. The notion of black in America is also, when the transatlantic slave trade, if you're going to get African people, forcefully destroy anything that they have as culture, intentionally. This is not like an accident. The language, the clothes, the religion, everything, and force upon them, European ideas so that they can be perpetually oppressed. One of the things you're also going to do is these white people are going to force upon them a name. That name, right now, we're saying black, but way back then, there are words that we just can't even utter nowadays, and that was just the term. And so this idea of white nationalism, this whiteness in and of itself, derives from ethnocide. They are trying to sustain ethnocide. And one thing to think about, and this is a key distinction between like ethnocide and genocide, is that white nationalism, they don't have an agenda of eradicating black people or eradicating brown people from the country. They just want black people and brown people to be in the country in a perpetually oppressive state so that they can occupy the jobs that like they don't want. If black people vote at large amounts, these white nationalists get quite upset. They love black people in America when they don't vote, because then there's just a whole mass of people that can be oppressed in perpetuity. So the narrative isn't, we're trying to exterminate all the black people. We're trying to terrorize people of color so that they stop trying to live as human beings. Because once they try to live as human beings in America, then that gives me I could be quite close to getting a drop of them. And once that drop of that blackness shows up in my family or this or whatever, this idea of white that people created hundreds of years ago, gone. I got a drop of it, that whiteness doesn't exist anymore. And so they're fighting to sustain this idea of whiteness that they came up with while they created while they implemented ethnocide. So it's not an idea, it's the action. The ideas are whiteness. That's just an idea. That's an idea that they came up with. Like, this is the label I can give myself to distinguish myself from the masses of people that don't look like me, that I'm going to systematically oppress in perpetuity and use that as a foundational component of my society. So it happens everywhere. That's what it is. It's ethnocide. He can project.
It's great listening to this, Barrett. Congratulations on the book. It's still in the mail, so wait. But maybe we'll deliver it soon. Congratulations to you, Andrea. I'm really I'm fascinated by the kind of categories. Because as you mentioned, like what's an idea, as much as black is an idea. And one of the things that always I found interesting is the perpetuation of whiteness, not simply as a static thing, right? If we were living in the 1700s, Benjamin Franklin would have found Swedish people too dark for him, basically the only white people. So they've always had to expand the notion of what is white in order to almost make up for their fallen numbers. You know what I mean? It's I'm Greek. We were let into the club some years ago. The Italians a little bit before then. So it's like it's this expansion of what is considered white with this somewhat almost fetishistic focus on blackness being the antithesis to that. And I guess my question is, how do you do you accept these categories as static and things that we now need words around it, or do we attack the categories? And what do we so because I've never liked the word whiteness because it's amorphous and it's almost like a club that people are then invited to join within a generation or two. And so it's you can see it also in Hispanic culture, like people come here and then within a generation do they graduate to certain to white privilege, or is that something that changes? So how do you talk about the categories as the static binaries that we have to accept as being
So what I would say
is something that can be challenged?
Yeah. So what I'd say is that the concept of whiteness, it's attempting to be a static binary, but existence isn't static. So there's going to be a static idea of people who look European that are like Anglo-Europeans. We're not, the inclusion of Mediterranean ones has been like a relatively new development. Browner ones you could pass for North African or Tunisian. That's been quite new. For the most part, it's been like Anglo-Scandinavian. That's what this static idea of whiteness is. And then as the rest of humanity comes to America, and Americans are like, what do we call these people within these rigid static structures that we created so that we can have perpetual normalized oppression and perpetuity? Next thing you know, some other white people get included into the mix because, sure, they can pass. They can pass and they'll change their names from, something really Italian to something that sounds super Anglo, and now we can pretend and they can pretend and lie to themselves that they're actually like Anglo people. And now they can have this type of whiteness, and we can articulate that being part of the group that gets to oppress other people is like an elevation and a privilege, and you get to be happy because you get to oppress people, and you should aspire to be that. America does that. That's the narrative. And so it's not like existence isn't static. Everything changes. Diversity is actually the fabric for existence at a cellular level, at an environmental level. That's just how it is. But this country structurally has attempted to have static identities, and we end up having conversations about what these identifiers are because reality always butts up against these ideas, these essences. And so we have to have conversations because the foundational part of it is flawed and problematic and will never, ever work. And so what we end up needing to do as a people is realize that we live in a country that has people from all over the world. You are going to have a language that articulates a common culture. We don't have that. We have a language that articulates a common nationality, but within that nationality, we know there's all these different classifications and tiers and racial stuff and inequalities and perpetual division. But we don't have a cultural identifier that's like when you come here, you get to be part of the shared common culture, and the people look like a mixture of all the people throughout the world. That's what's clearly starting to happen now, like organically, because existence makes people from different places say, ah, I like you, and oh wow, you're from someplace different, you're from someplace different. Now we made something new. That's happening. And so what we need to do is start having conversations and create language that identifies people at a cultural level and not these racial levels or these essence levels that are just a justification of oppression. So like at one part in the book I talk about this word that I cultivated, and maybe people will like it, maybe they won't. But it's this word Fricano, because I feel that the black community, our endeavor from the beginning has always been trying to liberate and emancipate ourselves from oppressive structures in the society. And one of those oppressive structures is just the name that oppressors have forced upon us. So, we were the N-word. We were a slew of words you can't say anymore. As we've gotten more agency, that changed to color, then it changed to black. Black with a lowercase b, now it's black with a capital B. But that's still, it's true. This is a progression. As we get more agency, we are telling people we're not just a color of people, we're a culture of people. The shift from a lowercase b to a capital B is that we're a proper noun. We're a culture of people, just like you capitalize someone who's like a Jewish person, that's a capital J. There's not a place on the map called Jewish where they're from. That's a culture of people, and that culture is represented in all sorts of different places. Capital B in black is that. But that's still a cultural identifier based on the color and not the culture of the people. And so, I have some great friends in the Latino community, and I was really quite inspired by the cultural names that Latinos have come up with, like Chicano. That is a name. That like we are Mexican, we don't live in Mexico anymore, we live in Southern California. Culturally, we're slightly different than Mexican people in Mexico. We need to come up with a name that distinguishes and talks about the uniqueness of being Mexican here. Let's come up with a name. And that name, they took off the ME in Mexicano, and it was an X, and that X became a CH, and then that became Chicano, because they're Mexicans but not in Mexico. And so from that inspiration, I got African, I cut off the A, and then that made Fricon, F-R-I-C-A-N, but now we're just talking about people whose cultural connection is that they were removed from Africa. And once they were removed from Africa, it's continuous ethnocidal oppression. That shared culture is getting destroyed at every waking moment on the continent. So what's bringing these people together is not that they're looking at someone and saying, oh, cool, we're both Malian and we're not like in Mali anymore, we're friends in this way. No, they're bringing together like we collectively have to free ourselves from this oppression. That's it. We look the same way, they're treating us the same, we have to make sure that we free ourselves from this. So freedom is a cultural definer for people of color and on this continent. That's it. We get together because we know we're in a shared struggle and we have to work together to try to free ourselves in some extent from this oppression. So I changed the FRI to FREE because that's a foundational cultural pillar of being black on two continents, essentially, and in the Americas. And then to be more linguistically inclusive, I added an O or an A at the end, which could also become an X or an E, depending on what your preference is for gendered words. That's a longer conversation that's existing within the Latino community, so I can't say one's better than the other. But like that is a title that you could use to articulate a culture of a people where now you're further liberating yourself from a discourse that's solely based on oppressive identifiers. And so to answer your question, and I talk a lot, is whiteness, the aspiration is for it to be static. That's what it's always been. The fact that reality and existence is never static means that there's always some sort of thing that's challenging it, but the thing that's challenging it is just existence itself. And if you have ideas that can't coexist with existence, at some point you just need to be able to say that this is a bad idea, and we culturally need to progress beyond it. Great question. Hey. Hey, Charles.
I love the idea of creating words to express our experiences, but there's some words that I find, I was just thinking about this yesterday, that already exist, that are flip-flop, like you said, and oftentimes people that are oppressed view their oppression as a problem, right? Is that fair to say?
They view their oppression as like a problem,
as a problem.
Like being oppressed is problematic.
Yeah, it's problematic.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier, like we're in a bad place, and what I realized yesterday is that there needs to be a shift in understanding that what we call a problem is somebody else's solution, and white dominant society solution. And what I mean by that is like, say mass incarceration is a problem for the black communities, right? But that's a solution to get rid of black men. We might view the war on drugs as a problem, but that's actually a solution to lock up black men, right? So, or subprime mortgages, we might view that as a problem, but that's somebody else's solution.
Yeah.
How do we shift our thinking to the dominant society's logic without losing ourselves?
Well, I guess the thing is like there's no shifting to the dominant side's logic. You just need to be aware of what their logic is. So like the word ethnocide, like the goal isn't to make other people engage in ethnocide. But if you know that the people who are cultivating the oppression in your society are implementing ethnocide, it makes it very easy for you to know what they're doing and why they're doing it. And also be able to articulate why their solution is a problem not just for you, but it's a problem for them. Like if I'm for example, say there's 4 people in a room, and 3 of those people are like, we can only do stuff if the 4th person can't do anything. How inefficient and detrimental that will that be forever? You know, like if the solution for the 3 people in the room is to make sure that the 4th person can't exist as an equal human being to them, the amount of effort that those 3 people have to do to prevent that person from doing stuff. Just think of all the stuff that they could do if all 4 of them worked together and did things. Their solution is a problem. It's a problem for them, it's a problem for the person who's being oppressed, it's a problem for everybody in the room. And so what we really need is precise language that we can articulate that what they call a solution isn't a solution. What they've been calling good for hundreds of years isn't good. It's never been good, it's never been good for them, it's never been good for people who are oppressing them, who are being oppressed. What we have instead is a discourse that has these people who've been doing bad things forever. We only have the language to justify, to articulate that that is good. So we don't need to go to their perspective. We just need to understand what their agenda is, so that we can clearly say to ourselves why that's bad, why I'm not a part of it, why it needs to exist over there, and why and how I can tell them that it's bad to them. I could have a conversation with them. This is what you're doing, and it's bad because of X, Y, and Z, and you should know that. And now I'm gonna go do something else. I don't need to have the same feeling as you because we're not the same. They made it so that we're not. That was their agenda. So I can't. We don't need it.
At a moment like this moment where sort of cutting edge thinking on the left is being marginalized, particularly in the political debate, the Democratic Party is trying to move to the center. As you think about the philosophy and the language that you're a proponent of, what's your fantasy for getting the middle of our country to use it as a framework and as language? How optimistic are you that someday soon it could catch on in places other than the left or right coasts?
So I guess what I'd say is I'm sure some people in the middle will use it. That's great. But one of the biggest problems in America is that there's so many people on the left that use different language to talk about this, to try to talk about the same things, where the left actually can't coalesce and do things together efficiently because they're all talking different, saying different things while believing that they feel the same. So we all know that the Latino community, if the Democrats could create a message that could galvanize them to vote at larger like margins, larger areas, we could win Texas. That happens, it's all over. We know that Stacey Abrams did a remarkable job in Georgia, and that got voter turnout in Georgia to increase a little bit, and we won Georgia. Like all of the areas where like Democratic turnout is like actually the majority of the areas, especially the South, where Republicans control, they control those areas not because they're winning the middle. It's because they're preventing people of color from accessing the ballot box, and the left doesn't have the language to coalesce this diverse group of people. Like the left needs is the language that you can say the same thing to a Latino, to an Asian American, to a Black American, to a white American who is like an activist and working for civil rights and is like trying to become part of that diverse community. They need to be able to speak the same language. And then if you do that, you don't really have to have a concern about these swing voters. Like once you have these concerns for the swing voters, next thing you know, you get these Democrats who half the time they're voting for Republicans and half the time they're voting for Democrats, and you're trying to pass legislation, and at the end of the day, you realize that you don't even have the same philosophy as these other people who say they're part of the same party, and you can't get anything done. Like, with regards to Republicans, if you look at their demographics and who their voters are, they're basically like the same type of people. They're able to galvanize all those people because they just speak the same language. Like, not only do they speak the same language, they, since Nixon, have been speaking in code to each other, where we call it dog whistles, where like they'll put out an ad where it's like wink wink, I'm not gonna say something racist, but this really is racist, and I'm gonna say that it's the most absurd thing I've ever heard. It's absolutely ridiculous because they're saying this isn't racist, but it is racist. People can't know that, but what I'm going to say is that it's called a dog whistle, so that they know that I'm saying something racist in code, and we all know that I'm doing that. And we all know that these people understand the code, and there's a term for the code, and then let's as a society act like we're not doing the same, like we're not doing racist stuff. It's outrageous. And then another thing that's like even weirder about it, I could talk about this for ages, but this is just so funny. It's called dog whistles. So like the Republican people that are putting out these dog whistle ads in code, they're like, these ads are only at a frequency that dogs can hear. And their supporters are the people that can only hear things at this high-pitched frequency. Is a point. So it's like they have this code word that's just racism without saying racism, and while they're doing it, they're calling their supporters dogs. And no one seems to think that this is problematic or bizarre. It's like it's crazy. Like if you were from another country and you saw this going on, you're like, this is absurd. They're literally saying we're speaking racist code. And so, like, that's the thing. The issue isn't how do Democrats find a discourse that gets the people in the middle. It's how do they get a discourse that can galvanize that diverse coalition of diverse people who are suffering systemic ethnocidal oppression in America, and we can have the same dialogue where we're not like competing against each other, where it's like, oh, if the black caucus gets this, and that means like the Latino caucus is way down here, and then the Asian caucus is like you just have to have the same discourse. That's really what the issue is. More questions.
I know. So we're going to take one more question.
Oh, really?
Yes.
All right.
What's the sign?
Well, maybe like 2 questions.
Okay. 2 questions. So we'll go.
Okay, no, sorry, not you.
Yeah,
you
you work for him. You can't ask a question. We're going to go with Kurt, and then we're going to go with this young lady over here. So I'll remember you.
You.
I may have missed this, but talk about like white proximity,
To what?
like the American desire for like white proximity.
Oh, okay.
I missed that.
I feel like you missed that. I feel like you said that.
You said that?
He's touched on it.
Go again.
I think we concur that you missed it, but maybe people have missed it. So I guess what I'd say, and I'll add like another layer to this.
Wait, so white proximity in culture, like how does it all kind of tie in?
Okay, well, first of all, linguistically, it's a dishonest foundation because what we're talking about is the culture that white people tried to create in this society is one of sustained division and exploitation and ethnocide, which is the opposite of what culture in other countries actually is, where people come together and say, what can we do to create stuff so that we can survive here in perpetuity? Here, it's let's divide people in one group of people that says, how can we survive by like taking stuff and exploiting the other group of people and just like come up with a language to normalize that forever. Um, so it's like that's the opposite of culture, but the linguistic corruption is that like we describe that as culture. So like there isn't like a word for bad. It's like if you live in society and the word for good was good and the word for bad was also good. So like that makes it quite complex. But what America does is the narrative of our society comes from the people who created an ethnocidal society. So they tell you get to come here and if you work really hard and do a bunch of stuff and like adhere to like their regulations, you get to get all the stuff that we're not going to tell you, but you get to get all that stuff due to like exploiting people. We just won't say it that it's exploiting. You just get it because you work really hard and you're a good person. Maybe some guy that lives in the sky and his kid thinks you're great, you know? And so, like, that's the narrative. And so people come to the country so that they can get that opportunity. They just don't know that that opportunity is something that's built upon, like, systemic exploitation. And so, clearly, the narrative to America isn't come here and you get to become a white person, but it's come here and you get to get a bunch of stuff that's great. Coincidentally, the stuff that's great, white people disproportionately have, so you end up wanting to have a proximity to white people so you can get that stuff. But no one immigrates to America because they get to have all the things that black people get. Like, that's just not a thing. Like, that just doesn't exist. No one will come to America and they said, you get to come here, you get to be treated like a black person forever. Just wouldn't happen. And so that's that.
Hey, so I have a question that I'm not sure if I'm going to reflect the best way forward. But as I've learned more about ethnocide, politics, and I think you wrote in your book, I have a question on the connection to either policy or realized, actualized change for the experience that we all share. Can you just speak to kind of how you see language or reframing language and communication culture to maybe it's policy, maybe it's not policy, but just like
Yeah.
reality that we all experience?
Great. So, for example, so language and philosophy precedes action. Language and philosophy is what creates the laws. Like the idea of like your government structure, that comes from the language and the philosophy of the society. So, just democracy in Europe, one of the big driving forces for that was that people got the language and philosophy from the Greeks and they started calling themselves citizens. Citizens instead of like serfs or peasants, and how they perceived the world, whether they got to engage in it and they just weren't beholden to like a king or the Catholic Church. And so you have to have the language so that you can come up with the ideas to make policies or government structures that were previously inconceivable. And then once you have the language and the philosophy to articulate and write things that people couldn't even imagine before, then you get to do things that were unimaginable and make like unprecedented change. And so that's how it can impact policy. But like a real simple example is I was talking to some people, I don't know, like 4 months ago, and they were talking about gentrification, because gentrification is a great way to talk about ethnocide. Because frankly, the issue with gentrification isn't that like people get upset that a white person lives in their neighborhood. It's that when they come into the neighborhood, the idea is, well, the fact that I live here and I brought money means that I'm better. And this place needs to change to suit how I see things because I'm just like inherently better than the culture that was here. And it's a position of like essentially like domestic colonization, cultural erasure. And our society has the language that justifies that. Where like the people that get pushed out that are people of color, that's, if they worked harder, made more money, but they should be thankful because someone bought their house and they got some more money and now they can live someplace else. Like we have language that justifies this being the norm. Let's say you have a norm where it's like, let's create something sustainable. And a language that's more about shared community and not just like being able to go wherever you want because you have wealth and that you're inherently good because you have money. you might come up with a policy that says, how about supporting generational homes? Where like when people sign leases or rents or this or that or whatever, the government policy where you find out that if this is a house that a grandparent's gonna live in, and then their kid's gonna live in that house, and then the grandkid might live in that same house. And we think that this is sustainable for the community because we know that that house is gonna be there and well taken care of for probably 100 years. And that the people that are gonna live there are probably gonna invest in that community. They might run for the school board and do all sorts of stuff. Now you have the language to articulate the benefit of multi-generational living, which is a thing that happens all throughout the world. So many places, like that's just how everyone lives. I saw something the other day in, I think it was Spain, where like too many people are living with their parents into their 30s and 40s. Like we actually need to incentivize people to like at least move across the street, Like, that's their dynamic because they have a sustainable structure that's based on keeping people together so much that they don't ever want to leave their parents' house because it's so great there. America doesn't have the language or the philosophy to even articulate or create policies to encourage that. And we know, especially in DC, man, DC is one of these fascinating places because you go here and man, there are black people who've lived in the district for generations. You can go to so many places in America, and that's just not the case. At some point, it might be like 2, 3 generations, and then that black person's like, I'm going to be successful, I'm going to move to New York, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and they leave, and they look bad at the place. Look, in D.C., it's like, I live in D.C., I'm going to live here forever. This is Chocolate City. Like, I'm upset that it's 49% black, Like, it needs to be at least 51. That's a thing where, like, in this place, it should be pretty easy for people to have the idea of creating policies to support multi-generational living. We don't think about it because we don't have the language or the philosophy to even imagine that that's a thing that you can do, that we could articulate and write it on pieces of paper. So the key thing is you have the language and the philosophy first. You get bolder and come up with ideas that everyone thought was crazy, and then you just do it. And then they see that it makes sense, and then they do it. And that's what it is. Like this whole book, I'll tell you, for a very long time, people thought I was a crazy person. And then at a certain point, once I wrote enough pages, they read it and they're like, this isn't crazy. This should be a book. This should be a book that I think people should buy. And there you go. And now they're like, the question is, your book is good. What are the things you want to do beyond the book? Simple. I read all the words. I can answer them. But like that's how it works. Did I answer your question?
Oh, that's so good. Thank you all for being here tonight. I've got to say, there are so many other points that we could have touched on, which is why you should definitely buy the book and read it in its entirety. And hopefully Barrett will join us again for another talk, when we get to the next phase of the Sustainable Culture Lab.
Oh, they invited me back already.
All right, so thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
And thanks for everybody. Oh, one last thing. If you would like to make a donation to support the Sustainable Culture Lab, you can go to the website for my book, The Crime Without a Name, and at the bottom there's a button for support, and you can support that. You can also get on my distribution list and reach out to me and things like that. But the questions that they ask is like, what am I going to do beyond the book? I want to do beyond the book, and I need people's support and connections and infrastructure to do that. And so you can do that. And thanks everybody at virtually and online for paying attention.